Riley Hargrove had lived on that wide stretch of land most of his life, and he believed he understood every sound the land could make. The whisper of wind against the dry grass, the distant call of a hawk, the low rumble of cattle moving across the field. But on this particular morning, before the sun had fully risen and the sky was only a soft gray, the land felt different. Still, quiet in a way that felt unusual. Even for that early hour, he drove his old ranch truck down the dirt road, dust lifting behind him in a long, faint cloud. Riley was a practical man. He didn't rush anything, he didn't scare easily, and he didn't get carried away by rumors. But he had learned long ago that if something felt off, it was better to pay attention than to ignore it. That morning felt off. He was on his way to the southern fence line, an area far from the main house and even farther from the nearest neighbor. People rarely came through that part of the land. Those who knew the area avoided it because it was uneven and full of old brush. Those who didn't know the area usually got lost trying to navigate it. So when Riley turned the final bend toward the abandoned cattle gate and saw someone standing in the middle of the road, his foot lifted from the gas pedal. At first, in the dim early light, he thought it might be a deer or maybe one of the strays from town. But as he got closer, the figure stepped forward, slowly and shakily. And he realized it was a person. A young man. Thin and pale. Wearing clothes that looked dusty and worn. Riley tapped the brakes and the truck rolled to a slow stop a few yards away. The young man lifted one arm as if he wanted Riley to stop completely. Riley lowered the window, expecting the stranger to ask for directions, or maybe a ride. That wasn't unusual. From time to time, hikers wandered too far, or travelers' cars broke down. Riley had helped enough lost strangers to know how to handle it, but this young man didn't look like someone who had simply taken a wrong turn. His eyes were wide, and his hands trembled slightly, as though he had been running for a long time. He stepped closer to the truck and leaned one hand on the door, trying to steady himself. Riley studied his face. The young man looked exhausted, but more than that, he looked scared deep, bone-level scared. Before Riley could ask if he needed help, the young man spoke in a low, shaky voice. "Stop, he'll kill you." The words were so soft, Riley almost thought he misheard them. The young man's lips moved slowly, like speaking required effort. Riley's brows pulled together. "Slow down," Riley said calmly. "Who are you talking about?" But the young man shook his head, backing away as if being too close to Riley's truck made him nervous. His eyes kept darting toward the open land behind him, the empty stretch of brush and rock. Riley followed his gaze, narrowing his eyes as he tried to see what the stranger might be looking at. Nothing moved. Nothing stood out. The desert was still. "Son," Riley said, opening the truck door. "Do you need help? Did someone scare you?" The young man didn't answer. He took one step back, then another. His breathing sounded unsteady, and his eyes looked unfocused, as if he had gone through something that his mind was still trying to process. Riley took a careful step toward him, keeping his voice gentle. Ranchers learned quickly how to speak calmly. It helped with nervous animals. It helped with nervous people too. "Hey now," Riley said. "You're okay. You can tell me what happened." The young man didn't stay long enough to explain. He shook his head again sharply, as if warning Riley, and whispered the same words. This time even softer. "Stop. Stop. Don't go down there." Then he turned and began running, more of a desperate jog than a full sprint back down the dirt road toward town. Riley watched him until he was nothing more than a moving shape swallowed by the haze of morning light. Riley exhaled and looked out in the direction the man had been staring. Still nothing. Not a sound except the faint rustle of early wind brushing against the scrub. He waited a long moment before getting back into his truck. His curiosity should have faded after seeing how troubled the young man was. Most people would have turned their truck around right then. But Riley had never been most people. The land was his responsibility. If something or someone was out here disturbing strangers, he needed to know. He continued forward, keeping his eyes alert. The tires rolled over loose gravel as the road narrowed. The rising sun cast long shadows across the ground, stretching like dark fingers between the rocks. Riley tried to shake off the feeling the stranger had left him with. Strange encounters happened from time to time. People wandered through the area thinking it was a shortcut or trying to explore something new. Some were simply confused or tired, or had personal troubles weighing on them. Still, the warning repeated in Riley's mind, steady and unnerving. Stop. He'll kill you. The words bothered him, not because they sounded dangerous, but because they sounded frightened. The young man wasn't trying to scare Riley. He was trying to protect him from something he believed was real. Riley drove a little slower now. The southern fence line had always been a bit unpredictable. Fallen branches, loose boards, sometimes signs that hikers or stray campers had passed through. Riley didn't like strangers messing with the land, but most of the time it was harmless. As he continued, he remembered the conversations he had heard in town over the past months. Nothing official. Just small talk whispered in the corner booth of the cafe, or traded between neighbors while buying feed. People were naturally curious, especially in quiet towns where news traveled slowly, and anything unusual was repeated until it became its own kind of story. Someone had mentioned a mysterious man living out in the hills. No one had ever gotten a good look at him. Some said he walked like he didn't belong in modern times. Others said he avoided town completely, only appearing near the edges of private land. It was just talk, the kind of story people added details to each time it was retold. Some of the younger ranch hands had even given him a nickname, the Devil of Bramble Ridge. Riley had laughed the first time he heard it. There was always a devil somewhere. Local legends kept towns entertained. Most of the time it was just someone misunderstood, or someone wanting to be alone. Riley didn't believe in dramatic stories. He believed in real problems he could see and fix. But after his encounter with the frightened young man that morning, those old whispers felt a little too close to real. He drove until he reached the wide bend where the land dipped into lower ground. Here the brush grew thicker, and the air carried the smell of dry earth and sage. Riley parked the truck and stepped out, stretching his back as he looked around. Everything seemed calm. Calm enough that Riley wondered again what the young man had been running from. He checked the fence posts as he walked along the line. Some sections of wire sagged. A few posts were old and leaning. He made mental notes to return later with tools. But the calm didn't reassure him. It made him listen more closely. At one point, he stopped walking altogether. The land was too quiet. Even the birds were absent. Riley stood still, resting one hand on a fence post as he scanned the horizon. Then he noticed the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints. Human. A single set. Leading away from the road and toward the canyon ridge. The prints were deep, spaced unevenly, and suggested the person had been moving quickly. Not running exactly, but not strolling either. Someone had passed through recently. Riley crouched down, brushing some loose dust away. The prints were fresh. That meant whoever had made them was nearby. He rose and squinted toward the ridge. Sunlight now touched the far hills in a warm gold, making the shadows look sharper. He felt a familiar tightening in his stomach, not fear, but alertness. Something was happening on his land. Something he needed to understand. He didn't go rushing after the tracks. He was too experienced for that. Instead, he made slow, careful steps, listening to everything around him. The land could warn him if he paid attention. The warning from earlier echoed again in his mind. Stop. Don't go down there. But Riley continued anyway. Not out of stubbornness, though he certainly had plenty of that. He continued, because something deep inside him insisted he had to. Whatever had frightened that young man, whatever had made him speak in that trembling voice, it was out here somewhere. And Riley wasn't going to turn a blind eye. The land was quiet. The wind was light. The sun was rising. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, Riley felt as if he had stepped into a moment that was bigger than he understood, and he walked forward, deeper into the stillness, not knowing that the warning he had been given was only the beginning of something much larger and much stranger than he had ever expected. Riley followed the footprints carefully, keeping his steps light so he could hear everything around him. He had walked this land thousands of times, yet the morning felt unfamiliar, like the ground itself was holding its breath. The soft light of early sun stretched across the dry grass, casting long shadows that shifted when the wind moved. The tracks led him farther south, to an area he hadn't visited in months. It wasn't part of his daily routine. The ground there was uneven, full of loose stones and overgrown brush. If something unusual ever happened on the ranch, it usually happened where people rarely went. As Riley walked, he kept thinking about the young man on the road, his tired face, shaky hands, and the way he whispered those words. Not shouted. Whispered. Like he was afraid even the air might hear him. "Stop, he'll kill you." The words repeated in Riley's mind again and again. And each time they felt stranger. He had lived long enough to know when a person was scared because of something real, and when they were scared because of their own worries. That young man hadn't seemed confused. He had seemed certain. But certain of what? Riley reached a part of the land where low bushes formed clusters around scattered rocks. He paused there, noticing something odd. The footprints he had been following suddenly changed direction. They dipped slightly into a shallow patch of dirt near the brush, then curved sharply toward a narrow trail leading to the ridge. But something else caught his eye. Alongside the footprints, there were long marks in the dirt, smooth lines, as if something had been dragged. Not heavy, but unusual. Like someone had pulled equipment, or a large bag. The marks weren't deep, so whatever made them wasn't heavy, but the lines were straight and clear. Riley crouched, running 2 fingers over the trail. The dirt was soft. The marks were recent. Very recent. He sighed quietly. He didn't like mysteries on his land. They usually meant trouble. Even if it was simple, trouble wanderers, campers leaving trash, or kids trying to explore. He straightened up and followed the marks. They led toward a small, open clearing near the canyon shelf. The clearing was sheltered by tall rocks on one side, making it easy for someone to hide something there without being seen from far away. As Riley stepped into the clearing, he spotted something lying in the center of it, a piece of his ranch equipment. One he hadn't noticed missing yet. It was an old bucket he used for carrying feed. It didn't belong out here. No one had any reason to bring it this deep onto the land. He walked closer and picked it up. The bucket looked dusty and worn, like someone had carried it a long way. That puzzled him even more. Why would anyone take such a thing from his barn and leave it here? It didn't make sense. Riley looked around, scanning the rocks and brush. He didn't see anything else out of place, but the feeling of wrongness lingered. Something about the scene seemed arranged, though he couldn't explain why. As if whoever had left the bucket wanted someone to find it. He set it aside gently and continued toward the canyon shelf. The land dropped slightly there, forming a natural path between 2 tall rocks. Riley stepped through, listening to the soft crunch of gravel under his boots. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of dry sage and dust. He followed the path until he reached a wider space near the ridge, a place where the land flattened just enough for cattle to wander. Riley scanned the ground again. More footprints, more drag marks. And near the base of a large rock, he noticed something else. One of his ranch tags. It was the small plastic kind he clipped to equipment so he could keep track of it. Seeing it here felt strange. Someone had clearly been moving things from his barn or storage shed and bringing them out to this remote spot. For what reason? He picked up the tag and turned it over in his palm. The number printed on it told him exactly where it belonged, the old supply shelf inside the main barn. Someone must have gone inside when he wasn't around. That thought made Riley's shoulders tighten. He respected privacy, his own and others. His barn wasn't locked most days, because most people in this part of the country believed in minding their own business. Neighbors, trusted neighbors, even strangers usually carried good intentions, but someone had crossed into his private space. Someone had taken things, not expensive things, not valuable things, but important things. Tools he used, supplies he needed. He slipped the tag into his pocket. Whatever was going on wasn't harmless wandering. Someone had been here with purpose. The silence around him grew heavier as he continued toward the ridge. The sun rose higher, warming the air. But the quiet remained unchanged. He heard neither birds nor the distant hum of insects. Even the wind seemed to hold itself back. Riley stopped again, letting his eyes adjust to the brightening landscape. Far across the open stretch, a lone tree stood crooked against the sky. To its right, the path curved toward an old structure he hadn't seen in years, the line shack. He exhaled slowly. The shack had been built long before Riley owned the land, back when ranchers needed simple shelters far from the main house. Riley had repaired it a few times over the years, but it was mostly unused now. It stood near the base of a rocky slope, half hidden by tall grass and brush. The tracks he was following led directly toward it. Riley hesitated. Not out of fear, he wasn't the type to scare easily, but out of concern. The young man's warning drifted back to him again, mixing with the uneasy quiet. Stop, don't go down there. But the tracks clearly indicated the person had gone down there. And if the young man had been running from someone, that someone would likely be near the shack. Riley breathed in slowly. He had two options. He could turn back and call the sheriff to check the place, or he could go look himself. Most people would have chosen the first option. Riley knew that. But he also knew the sheriff's office was far, and they wouldn't take over a simple trespassing case immediately. He didn't want someone sitting on his land, walking through his supplies, or leaving strange marks in the dirt for another day. He felt responsible for the land. If something was wrong, he wanted to face it himself. So he stepped forward. As he approached the shack, he noticed a few changes. The grass around it was crushed in places, as if someone had walked back and forth repeatedly. The door, which usually stayed closed because of the wind, hung open slightly. Riley slowed his steps but kept moving. He didn't hear anything inside, not movement, not footsteps, not a voice, but he could sense the presence of someone who had been there recently. Before he reached the doorway, he saw something near the base of the wall, more empty cans. Someone had eaten here. Small pieces of paper rustled slightly in the breeze, wrappers from food. Someone had been staying long enough to make a small mess. He stepped into the doorway and paused. Inside the shack, sunlight slipped through cracks in the wood, casting thin beams across the floor. A blanket was spread over an old crate. A few belongings were neatly placed in a corner, arranged in a way that didn't look careless. Whoever had stayed here was organized, maybe even careful, but the wall caught Riley's attention most. Someone had traced simple shapes into the wood, maybe symbols, maybe doodles, maybe just marks of boredom. They weren't threatening. They were simply odd, almost like someone trying to leave a trail of reminders for themselves. Riley stepped inside fully. The air smelled faintly of dust, and something else, soap, maybe. It was strange. Not unpleasant, just unexpected. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the scene, a soft sound reached his ears. Not loud, not sharp, just a faint shift of gravel outside. Riley froze. He turned slowly, listening. Another small sound, a step, then silence. Someone was nearby. He stepped back toward the door, careful not to make noise. He looked left, then right. The land was empty, but he knew what he heard. He wasn't imagining anything. Someone was out there, maybe watching, maybe waiting. Riley kept his breathing steady. He didn't call out. He didn't move fast. He simply stepped outside, calmly, like a man who knew better than to rush into anything he didn't understand. The sun brightened the ridge. The wind brushed the grass. The land looked peaceful, too peaceful. Riley stood still, listening. Maybe the person had moved behind the rocks. Maybe they were on the trail. Maybe they were somewhere he couldn't see. And the stranger from the road, what had he been running from? Riley didn't know yet. But he knew one thing for certain. Someone had been living on his land. Someone had been inside his barn. Someone had been watching. And whatever the warning had meant, this was only the beginning. Riley stood outside the line shack, letting the silence settle around him. The sound he had heard, a light shift of gravel, still echoed in his mind. He knew it wasn't the wind. He knew it wasn't an animal. After living on the land for so many years, he could tell the difference between natural sounds and human footsteps. Someone had been nearby. The morning sun had fully risen now, making the world brighter, sharper, and less forgiving to anything that tried to hide. The landscape stretched out in soft sunlight, the tall grass, the low brush, the rocks that gathered heat as the day grew warmer. Everything looked normal. But normal didn't match the uneasy feeling inside Riley. He took a few slow steps away from the shack, turning in a small circle to study the land. It was quiet. Too quiet for his comfort. He kept expecting to see movement from behind a rock or a shadow shifting in the distance. But there was nothing. A thought came to him as clearly as if someone whispered it. Someone knows you're here. Not in a dramatic way, not like a warning, just a quiet truth Riley could not ignore. Whoever had been staying in the shack likely wasn't far. People didn't leave their belongings behind if they were gone for good. Someone must have stepped outside when Riley arrived, maybe to avoid being seen, maybe to watch from a safer distance. The idea didn't scare him, but it made him cautious. Caution was part of ranch life. It was as natural to him as breathing. Riley walked slowly around the shack, scanning the ground for fresh prints. He found some light steps heading toward the rocks beside the structure. The footprints were narrow, with a small heel, probably from someone who walked carefully, someone who didn't want to make noise. He followed the tracks a little way, but they faded near the rocks. The person might have stepped onto hard stone to keep from leaving signs behind. Smart, Riley thought. Or at least careful. He paused again, letting the wind brush past him. The breeze carried a faint scent, something clean, maybe from the soap he had smelled inside. It reassured him a little. Whoever was staying here might simply be someone trying to be left alone. Someone who didn't want trouble. Still, the missing ranch items and the frightened young man on the road painted a confusing picture. There was something more happening here. Something Riley hadn't quite put together. He returned to the shack door and stepped inside again. The sunlight through the cracks shifted as clouds drifted overhead, creating moving strips of light across the floor. The simple bedding, the neat pile of belongings, and the marks on the wall all seemed strangely organized. Riley walked closer to the wall, studying the symbols more carefully. They weren't complex, just simple shapes, maybe made by someone passing the time. Circles, lines, a few arrows, but something about them felt purposeful, like the person had been trying to map something in their head. He leaned closer and traced his finger gently near one of the shapes. It looked like a ridge line, the same ridge he had crossed to get here. Another line looked like a long path twisting around the canyon, and a small shape near the corner might have represented the shack itself. It hit him then. The marks were a homemade map. Someone had been keeping track of the land, watching it, following paths, writing it down in their own quiet way. Riley stepped back, trying to understand. Why map his land? Why live out here, away from everyone? Why stay hidden? The young man's warning returned once more. Stop, don't go down there. The words had felt dramatic earlier, but now they carried weight. Someone had spooked that young man enough to send him running. But was it the same person who lived here, or someone else? Riley wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. Life had taught him to look at everything slowly and clearly. So he checked the shack again, searching for anything that might offer answers. In the far corner, tucked under the blanket, he found a small notebook. He didn't open it at first. It wasn't his habit to go through another person's things, but considering someone had entered his barn and moved his belongings, he convinced himself that taking a quick look might explain what was happening. The notebook was thin, with a worn cover. Riley opened it slowly. Most pages held simple sentences and dates, written in careful handwriting, a journal, or maybe notes to self. Some entries were about weather. Some mentioned hearing distant sounds, voices, footsteps, or animals. Others described sunsets, quiet mornings, and reminders like, "Fix the door tomorrow," or "Don't stay out too late." Nothing alarming. Nothing strange. Only quiet thoughts from someone who seemed to spend a lot of time alone. But near the end of the notebook, a few entries caught Riley's attention. Someone came near the barn last night. I saw their light but didn't want them to see me. I hid behind the old tree. People don't want me here. I should be careful. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I only go to the barn because I need supplies. I will put things back when I can. Riley's eyebrows lifted slightly. The person had entered the barn, but they hadn't meant harm. They had taken small things because they needed them. And from the tone of the entries, the person didn't want to be seen at all. He read the last entry. I heard someone on the road, didn't want them to see me, stayed still. The young man seemed frightened. I hope he is okay. Riley closed the notebook gently. So the person staying here wasn't chasing anyone. They weren't threatening anyone. They were avoiding the world, quietly, perhaps for reasons only they understood. That changed everything. Riley stepped back outside, bringing the notebook with him. He wanted to talk to this person calmly, kindly, with open patience. He understood solitude. He understood people needing space, but he still needed to know why his supplies were taken. He looked around again. Hello? He called gently, his voice steady and warm. I'm not here to cause trouble. I only want to talk. No answer. He tried again, with more care. If you're nearby, it's okay. You don't need to hide. A soft breeze brushed against his face, but no one stepped forward. Riley continued, I found your things. I found your notes. I know you didn't mean harm. Still nothing. He didn't push harder. He didn't want to scare anyone who was already trying to avoid being seen. Instead, he placed the notebook on the doorstep of the shack, making sure it was easy to spot. Then he walked a short distance away and sat on a large rock. He didn't shout. He didn't demand anything. He simply waited. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Riley wasn't counting. He was patient by nature. Patience had taught him how to raise animals, how to fix fences, how to live with the land. Eventually, he heard a soft sound, barely a whisper of movement. A shape appeared near the rocks beside the shack. A thin figure, tall but slightly bent, as if trying to make themselves smaller. They wore simple clothes, dusty from the land. Their hair was a bit messy, but their face was calm, not threatening, not angry, just cautious. Riley stayed still. The figure stepped closer, but slowly. The person glanced at the notebook on the doorstep, then at Riley, then back at the notebook. Riley waited until they made eye contact. Then he said, gently, I'm Riley. This is my land. You've been living here for a while. The person nodded slightly. I'm not angry, Riley continued. I just want to understand. The figure hesitated, then walked to the notebook and picked it up. Their hands trembled slightly, not from fear of Riley, but from the nervousness of someone who wasn't used to speaking with others. Riley smiled softly, trying to ease the tension. It's all right. The person finally spoke, their voice quiet but steady. I didn't want to disturb anyone. Riley nodded. I know. I read your notes. The figure looked ashamed. I only borrowed things. I planned to return them. Riley smiled again. We'll talk about that. But first, can you tell me your name? The person hesitated, then answered, Calder. Riley repeated the name softly. Calder. Okay. Calder relaxed a little, though still standing a few steps away. I came here to be alone. I didn't think anyone would mind. Riley looked around at the vast land, the quiet ridge, the gentle wind. It's a peaceful place. He agreed. Calder nodded. Riley waited a moment before speaking again. There was a young man on the road earlier. He seemed frightened. Do you know anything about that? Calder shook his head quickly. No. He saw me by accident when I was walking near the ridge. I think I startled him. I didn't mean to. That made sense. The young man may have seen someone in the early morning shadows and panicked. The warning he gave Riley had come from fear, not from danger. Riley exhaled slowly, letting the tension fade from his shoulders. The mystery was finally becoming clear. Calder wasn't a threat. He wasn't doing anything wrong except living where he didn't belong. And he wasn't trying to cause harm, he was trying not to be seen. But there was still one more question. Why was Calder hiding? Riley watched him quietly, waiting for the moment Calder would offer the truth. And as the sun brightened the ridge, Calder finally began to explain, slowly, gently, and with a voice that carried a story Riley had never expected. Calder stood quietly in front of Riley, holding his small notebook with both hands as if it were something precious. He looked unsure about what to say next. Riley didn't rush him. He simply waited, giving Calder the space to speak in his own time. The wind brushed softly across the ridge, rustling the dry grass. Far off in the distance, a bird finally called, breaking the morning silence that had hung around them. The sound felt like a sign that whatever tension had existed between the land and the moment was beginning to lift. Calder looked down at his notebook, then finally spoke. "I came here because it was quiet," he said softly. "I needed a place where no one expected anything from me. Where I could think." Riley nodded. "There's plenty of quiet out here." Calder's shoulders relaxed a little. "I didn't want to be in town. Too many people. Too much noise. Too many questions. I thought if I stayed far enough away, no one would notice." Riley listened carefully. Calder wasn't speaking with anger. He wasn't upset. He was simply explaining, the way someone might explain why they preferred one hobby over another. But there was something deeper beneath his words, something unspoken but clear to Riley. Calder had come to the ridge not to hide from others, but to find himself. Riley took a slow breath. "I understand needing space," he said quietly. "And I'm not here to take that from you. And I'm not here to take that from you." Calder looked up, surprised by his calm tone. "But," Riley continued gently, "I wish you had told someone. You've been borrowing things from the barn. You've been walking around the land without saying a word. That can worry people." Calder nodded slowly. "I know. I shouldn't have done that. I didn't think anyone would mind something small." "Mal." Riley smiled a little. "It's not the items. It's the surprise of finding them gone." Calder lowered his eyes. "Sorry." Riley wasn't angry. He could see Calder meant his apology. He could also see something else. Calder was tired. Not the kind of tired that came from walking or working, but the kind that came from carrying too many thoughts alone. To ease the mood, Riley asked gently, "Where are you from, Calder?" Calder hesitated. "From a town north of here. I lived with a relative for a while. I tried working odd jobs, but nothing felt right. I didn't like crowded places. I didn't like noise. I felt like I couldn't breathe." He paused. "So I walked. I walked until I reached the hills. And then I kept walking until I found this place. It felt safe." Riley nodded. He could understand that. The land had a way of offering comfort to people who needed quiet. It had offered him comfort many times in his own life. Calder continued, "I didn't want to trouble anyone. When I saw a house or a road, I always walked the other way. But that morning, the morning the young man saw me, I wasn't paying attention. I stepped out too far." "Did he see you up close?" Riley asked. Calder shook his head. "No, just from a distance. I think he was already nervous before he saw me. Maybe he thought I was someone else." That made sense to Riley. Sometimes, fear came from things in a person's own mind. Sometimes, a shadow looked like more than it was. The young man had likely walked through the quiet land at dawn, heard a sound, seen a figure, and panicked. It happened more often than people admitted. Riley sighed softly. "I wish he hadn't been so scared. He was worried enough to warn me." Calder's eyes widened slightly. "He warned you?" "Yes," Riley said. "He told me to stop. He thought something bad would happen if I kept going." Calder looked troubled, as if sorry for the misunderstanding. "I never wanted to frighten anyone." "I know," Riley said kindly. "And I know now that you weren't chasing him or watching him." Calder nodded. Riley took a slow breath. "Calder, you can stay for now. I'm not asking you to leave immediately. But you can't live out here forever without talking to anyone. It's not safe for you. If something happened, if you got sick or lost, you'd have no one to help you." Calder looked down again, considering Riley's words carefully. "I didn't think of that. That's why people live near each other," Riley said gently. "We all need help sometimes. Calder held the notebook close to his chest. He looked torn. Part of him clearly wanted to stay on the quiet land, and part of him understood Riley's point. After a moment, Calder asked in a timid voice, "Would you be angry if I stayed a little longer? Just a few more days?" Riley shook his head. "No, I'm not angry. But I want you to come to the house later. You can eat something, clean up, rest properly. Then we can talk about what's next." Calder looked genuinely surprised. "You'd let me come to your house?" "Of course," Riley said. "I'm not leaving you out here alone." Calder didn't respond right away, but Riley noticed a small, cautious smile forming. It wasn't a full smile, and it wasn't confident. But it was there, a tiny sign of trust. Riley stood up from the rock and dusted his hands. "For now, let's take things one step at a time. You don't need to rush." Calder nodded slowly. One step at a time. They stood together for a moment, letting the quiet morning settle around them. The air felt lighter now, the way it often did after a storm passed, even though no storm had actually come. It was a different kind of storm they had weathered that day, one made of misunderstanding and silence. Riley took a few steps toward the path leading back to the truck. "Come with me. I'll drive us up to the house." Calder hesitated. "Can I get my things first?" "Of course," Riley said. Calder walked into the shack, gathered the small items he had kept there, and folded the blanket neatly. He didn't leave a mess. He didn't leave anything scattered. He respected the place as if it had been his own home. When he stepped outside again, he paused and looked around as if saying a quiet goodbye to the little shelter that had kept him company for so long. Together, he and Riley began walking toward the truck. As they reached the clearing near the ridge, Riley glanced at Calder. "We'll get you settled," he said. "You don't have to explain everything today. Just rest first." Calder nodded again. "Thank you. I didn't expect someone to be kind." Riley smiled slightly. "The world isn't always kind, but I can be." Calder's shoulders relaxed fully for the first time since Riley met him. He looked younger now, lighter, as if carrying less worry. When they reached the truck, Riley opened the passenger door and gestured for Calder to get in. Calder stepped inside, quietly but willingly. As Riley climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced at Calder and said, "I'm glad you didn't hide from me today." Calder gave a soft, sincere answer. "I'm glad too." Riley started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, dust rising gently behind them as they began the slow drive back toward the main ranch house. The land around them, once heavy with silence and uncertainty, now felt warm again, simple, calm, familiar. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Calder felt something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of belonging. And for the first time in a long while, Riley felt something he didn't expect either, that helping a stranger had given him a deeper understanding of his own quiet life. The young man on the road had been right to be scared, but wrong about the reason. There was no dangerous person waiting in the hills. No hidden threat, only a gentle, lonely soul trying to find peace in a world that had overwhelmed him. The warning had been dramatic, yes, but the truth was far simpler, far kinder. And as the truck moved over the dirt road and headed home, both men felt something shift inside them, a new beginning, shaped by patience, understanding, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger.